The early morning mist clung to the streets of White Peak like a ghostly blanket, and Milan Rodriguez pulled her orange safety vest tighter against the penetrating cold. At 47, her hands were still strong and calloused from years of gripping mountain rock and navigating treacherous cliff faces. But now they held a street sweeper's broom instead of climbing rope. The transformation from professional mountaineer to municipal worker had been deliberate, a choice born from grief and guilt that had shaped 8 years of her life. The small mountain town of White Peak stretched before her in the pale dawn light, its cobblestone streets lined with snow that never seemed to completely melt, even in the height of summer. Founded in 1892 by silver miners, the town had evolved into a quiet community of 3,000 residents who valued privacy and simplicity over the tourist crowds that flocked to larger mountain destinations. Milan had been drawn to White Peak precisely because of its anonymity. Here, she could disappear into routine work, away from the climbing community that had once been her entire world. The town sat at an elevation of 8,200 feet, surrounded by peaks that soared to over 14,000 feet. It was beautiful in a way that could take your breath away, but Milan rarely looked up at the mountains anymore. She pushed the wheeled garbage bin down Maple Street, collecting the usual debris: coffee cups from the early commuters, cigarette butts from the handful of smokers who still braved the cold, yesterday's newspapers soggy from melted snow and morning dew. The work was simple, predictable, and most importantly, safe. It involved no split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. No one depended on her expertise or leadership. If she made a mistake, the worst consequence was a missed piece of trash. Everything her old life hadn't been. The mountains loomed above White Peak like silent giants, their snow-covered peaks catching the first rays of sunlight. Milan rarely looked up at them anymore, but today something made her pause. Storm clouds were gathering around the highest peaks, thick and dark, with the particular heavy quality that meant serious weather was coming. She knew those clouds intimately. She'd seen them before, 8 years ago, on what should have been just another routine climbing expedition in Colorado. "Morning, Milan," called Mrs. Chen from her bakery window, interrupting Milan's dark thoughts. "Looks like we're in for another big snow. Weather Service is calling for 18 inches starting tonight." Milan waved back with a gloved hand, forcing a smile. Mrs. Chen was kind to her, like most people in White Peak. They knew she'd been a professional climber once, the kind of person who guided wealthy clients up dangerous peaks and appeared in mountaineering magazines. They knew something bad had happened that made her leave that world behind. But they didn't ask questions, which Milan appreciated more than she could express. The people of White Peak had their own unspoken code. Everyone deserved a chance to start over, and everyone's past was their own business, unless they chose to share it. It was one of the reasons Milan had stayed here longer than anywhere else since the accident. She continued her route, sweeping around the old fountain in the town square. The fountain had been installed in 1895 and featured a bronze statue of a miner panning for gold. In summer, children threw coins into it and made wishes. In winter, it became a gathering place for the town's small population of homeless individuals who knew the nearby heating vents provided some warmth. Children were walking to school now, bundled in thick coats and scarves, their breath visible in small puffs. Their laughter echoed off the stone buildings, a sound that usually made Milan smile. Today, though, she felt uneasy. The wind was picking up, and it carried the particular bite that mountaineers learned to recognize as the harbinger of serious weather. Milan had been reading weather patterns since she was 12 years old, when her father first took her hiking in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains near their home in Colorado. By 16, she could predict changes in mountain weather with an accuracy that impressed even veteran climbers. By 25, she was leading expeditions up some of the most challenging peaks in North America. That expertise had made her one of the youngest certified mountain guides in Colorado. It had also made her overconfident, she sometimes thought. Confidence in the mountains was necessary for survival, but overconfidence could get people killed, as she'd learned the hard way. By noon, the snow was falling heavily, thick flakes that reduced visibility and accumulated quickly on every surface. Milan finished her morning route early and headed to the town maintenance building, a modest structure that housed the equipment and offices for White Peak's small public works department. Her supervisor, Joe Martinez, was studying weather reports on his computer, his weathered face creased with concern. Joe was a local who'd been born and raised in White Peak, and his family had lived in the area for 4 generations. He understood mountain weather as well as anyone, and Milan could see that what he was reading worried him. "This storm's going to be a big one," he said without looking up from the screen. "Weather Service is calling for 3 feet of snow by tomorrow morning. Wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour. They're already talking about closing the highway." Milan nodded, hanging up her vest on its designated hook. She'd lived through plenty of mountain storms. The town would manage. It always did. White Peak was prepared for severe weather in ways that lower elevation communities couldn't imagine. Every building had backup heating, every household kept emergency supplies, and the town's snow removal equipment was maintained to military standards. But as she walked home to her small apartment above Rossi's hardware store, the uneasiness remained. She climbed the narrow stairs, each step creaking under her boots in a rhythm she'd grown accustomed to over the past 3 years. Her apartment was simple: a kitchen barely large enough for one person, a living room with a couch and television, a bedroom with a bed and small dresser, and a bathroom with a shower that provided just enough hot water for a quick rinse. The walls were bare except for one photograph: Milan with 2 other climbers on a sunny peak in Colorado's Front Range. She tried not to look at it most days, but the picture drew her eye like a magnet. Sarah Martinez and David Kim smiled back at her, their faces bright with the joy of a successful climb and the satisfaction that came from pushing human limits in one of the world's most beautiful and dangerous environments. Milan touched the glass gently, her fingertip tracing Sarah's face. Sarah had been 28, a talented climber with dreams of conquering Everest and becoming the youngest woman to complete the 7 summits, the highest peaks on each continent. She'd been saving money for 3 years to fund her Everest expedition, working double shifts as an emergency room nurse in Denver. David was 35, a geology professor at the University of Colorado who climbed for the pure love of being in the mountains. He could identify rock formations and mineral compositions with a glance, and he saw beauty in landscapes that others found harsh and forbidding. He'd never been interested in fame or records, just in the quiet satisfaction of standing on summits and understanding the earth beneath his feet. They'd been climbing Torrens Peak, a challenging but not extremely dangerous mountain in the Sawatch Range. It was the kind of peak Milan had climbed dozens of times, technical enough to be interesting, but well within the capabilities of experienced climbers. The weather had been perfect when they started: clear skies, light winds, excellent visibility. But mountain weather could change in minutes, and it had. The storm came from nowhere, bringing winds that could knock a person off their feet and snow so thick they couldn't see 5 feet ahead. Milan had made the decision to turn back, but they were already too high up, past the point where retreat was simple. The descent became a nightmare of whiteout conditions, steep terrain, and growing panic. In the confusion and near-zero visibility, Sarah had missed a step and fallen 40 feet onto a ledge. By the time Milan and David rappelled down to reach her, Sarah was unconscious with a severe head injury and possible internal bleeding. They'd managed to get her to a small emergency shelter, really just a wind-resistant tent, but the storm lasted 2 days, and their radio couldn't reach rescue teams through the interference. Sarah never woke up. David had tried to go for help on the 2nd day when the wind died down slightly. He'd volunteered, insisting that his longer legs and greater upper body strength made him the logical choice. Milan had wanted to go herself. She was the most experienced in severe weather conditions. But David had already been gearing up, and every minute of delay reduced Sarah's chances of survival.
He'd made it less than 100 yards before falling through a snow bridge into a hidden crevasse. Milan had heard his calls for help getting weaker and weaker until they stopped completely. She'd tried to rappel down to reach him, but the crevasse was too deep and unstable, and she would have been killed in the attempt. She'd been found 3 days later by a helicopter rescue team, alone and barely alive from hypothermia and dehydration. The guilt had been overwhelming. As the most experienced climber, she'd been the leader. Their deaths were her responsibility. She should have recognized the weather signs earlier. She should have insisted on turning back sooner. She should have been the one to go for help. The climbing community had been understanding. Accidents happened in the mountains, and everyone who spent time at altitude accepted the risks. The official investigation found no evidence of negligence or poor decision-making. But Milan knew the truth. She'd been responsible for 2 people's lives, and she'd failed them. She'd never climbed again. Milan turned away from the photograph and walked to her small kitchen. Outside, the snow was falling even harder now, and the wind was beginning to howl around the building. She made herself a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, listening to the storm build in intensity. The weather reminded her too much of that terrible day in Colorado. Around 8 o'clock, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Joe's name.
Milan, I hate to bother you at home, but we've got a developing situation. The Weather Service just upgraded their warning. This storm is going to be much worse than they initially predicted. They're calling it a blizzard now, with possible avalanche danger in the high country. Milan felt her stomach tighten. What do you need me to do? Nothing tonight. The roads are already too dangerous for travel. But tomorrow, after the storm passes, we'll probably need all hands to help with cleanup. The town council is worried about the Sunset Care Home up on Hillside Drive. It's pretty exposed up there, and they're concerned about access for emergency services.
Milan knew the place well. Sunset Care Home sat on a small plateau about halfway up the hillside, surrounded by mature pine and aspen trees. The facility housed 42 elderly residents, ranging in age from 68 to 96, along with a staff of 12. It was a good facility with an excellent reputation, but its location had always seemed risky to anyone with mountain experience. Are they evacuating the residents? Milan asked. That's the thing. The storm hit faster than anyone expected. The roads are already impassable. They're stuck up there until it's over. After Joe hung up, Milan couldn't concentrate on anything. She tried to read a mystery novel she'd borrowed from the library, but the words blurred together. She tried to watch television, but kept thinking about the care home. The wind outside was howling now, shaking the entire building and rattling her windows in their frames. Around midnight, she gave up trying to sleep and made coffee. She sat at her small kitchen table, staring out at the swirling snow. The storm was fierce, but she'd seen worse. What worried her was what might happen when it was over. Copper Mountain loomed directly above the care home, and Milan knew its terrain intimately. She'd hiked and climbed in the area many times during her first year in White Peak before she'd forced herself to stop going into the mountains. The mountain was steep and unstable, with several large cornices, overhanging ledges of snow that could collapse without warning. All that new snow, combined with wind loading, could create perfect avalanche conditions. The care home was positioned directly in what mountaineers called a run-out zone. The path an avalanche would naturally follow down the mountain. Milan rubbed her temples, trying to ease the tension that was building behind her eyes. She was probably worrying about nothing. The care home had been there for 15 years without any serious problems. The mature trees around it would help anchor the snow. The building itself was sturdy and had been designed to withstand heavy snow loads. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She pulled out a topographic map of the area, one of the few climbing-related items she'd kept after the accident. Studying the contour lines and elevation markers, she traced the natural drainage patterns on Copper Mountain. The care home sat directly in the path of at least 3 potential avalanche chutes. The more she studied the map, the more concerned she became. Milan woke to an eerie silence that was almost more unsettling than the howling wind had been. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed world. She checked her phone. 6:30 a.m. The digital weather display showed the temperature at -8 degrees Fahrenheit, with no wind. She dressed quickly in layers: thermal underwear, wool sweater, insulated pants, and her heavy winter boots. When she stepped outside, the sight took her breath away. White Peak was buried under nearly 4 feet of snow. Cars were completely covered, looking like strange white sculptures. The street signs barely peeked above the drifts, and the familiar landmarks of the town had been transformed into an alien landscape. The air was crystal clear and so cold it burned her lungs. In the distance, Copper Mountain glowed pink in the sunrise, its snow-covered faces looking deceptively peaceful. Her phone buzzed. Joe again. "Milan, thank God you're up. We've got a serious situation developing. Can you meet me at the fire station in 20 minutes? What's happening? I'll explain when you get here. And Milan, bring any climbing gear you might still have." Milan's heart started racing. She hurried back upstairs and pulled a dusty equipment bag from the back of her bedroom closet. Inside were her old climbing harness, several lengths of rope, carabiners, pitons, and other gear. She hadn't touched them in years, but she'd never been able to throw them away. Seeing them now brought back a flood of memories, some wonderful, others painful. The walk to the fire station took twice as long as usual. Milan had to break trail through knee-deep snow, and the cold was so intense that her breath formed ice crystals that fell tinkling to the ground. When she arrived, she found Joe talking urgently with Fire Chief Patricia Williams and several other town officials. "Milan, thank you for coming," Chief Williams said as she entered the warm building. "We need your expertise." "What's going on?" Chief Williams pointed to a large topographic map spread across a table. Red pins marked various locations throughout the area. "About an hour ago, we lost all communication with Sunset Care Home. We sent Officer Brooks up Hillside Drive on his snowmobile to check on them, but he couldn't get through. The road is completely blocked by fallen trees and snow drifts that are 15 feet deep in places." Milan studied the map, recognizing the terrain features she'd been analyzing the night before. Hillside Drive wound up the mountain in a series of switchbacks, climbing about 1,200 feet in elevation over 3 miles before ending at the care home. It was the only vehicle access to the facility. "Have you tried calling them?" Milan asked. "Phone lines are down throughout the upper elevations. Cell towers, too. The storm knocked out power to most of the mountain, and the backup generators at the cell sites have apparently failed." Joe pointed to a red pin marking Officer Brooks' furthest penetration up the mountain. Brooks managed to get about halfway up before he had to turn back. He said the snow conditions look very dangerous, very unstable, and he reported hearing what sounded like small avalanches higher up the mountain. Chief Williams looked directly at Milan with an expression that mixed hope and desperation. "We need someone with mountain experience to assess the situation. Can you get up there?" Milan felt her chest tighten with familiar anxiety. "I don't know. I haven't done any serious climbing or mountain travel in years. But you still know how to evaluate avalanche danger, right? You still understand mountain conditions?" Milan nodded reluctantly. She'd been trained in avalanche safety as part of her mountain guide certification, and it was knowledge that never really left you. The ability to read snow conditions, recognize danger signs, and navigate safely through unstable terrain was like riding a bicycle. Once learned, never completely forgotten. "Look," Chief Williams continued, "we've got 42 elderly people up there, plus staff. Some of them need daily medication that can't be skipped. Several are on oxygen. At least 3 are diabetic and need insulin. We can't just wait and hope they're okay." Milan studied the map more carefully, tracing possible routes with her finger. There was another approach, a hiking trail that approached the care home from the east. It was steeper and more technically challenging, but it might be passable for someone with the right skills and equipment. "This trail," she said, pointing to a thin line on the map. "Eagle Ridge Trail. It connects to the service road behind the care home." Joe shook his head immediately. "That trail is for experienced hikers in perfect weather conditions. In these conditions, it would be suicide." "Not necessarily," Milan said slowly, her mind automatically shifting into the analytical mode she'd developed during years of planning dangerous climbs. "The trail follows a ridgeline, so it's less prone to avalanche activity than the valley routes. And it's partially sheltered by rock formations that would provide some protection from slide debris." She was quiet for a moment, thinking through the technical challenges. The old Milan would have been excited by this kind of problem, finding a safe route through dangerous terrain under challenging conditions. But that Milan had gotten 2 people killed. "I'll go," she said finally, "but I go alone. I won't be responsible for anyone else getting hurt." "Milan, you don't have to," Chief Williams began. "If I'm doing this, I'm doing it my way," Milan interrupted. "No backup team, no radio contact that might encourage me to take unnecessary risks to maintain communication. I'll assess the situation at the care home and report back when I return." Chief Williams nodded, recognizing the non-negotiable tone in Milan's voice. "What do you need?" "A snowmobile to get me to the trailhead. Food and water for 24 hours. A comprehensive first aid kit. And a satellite phone that works reliably." "The satellite phone I can do. What about backup plans?" Milan was already thinking through contingencies. "If I'm not back in 18 hours, assume something went wrong. Don't send anyone after me. The conditions will be too dangerous. Instead, contact the National Guard and request a helicopter evacuation as soon as weather permits." An hour later, Milan was loading her gear onto a snowmobile driven by Officer Brooks. The trip to the Eagle Ridge trailhead took 40 minutes through deep snow and around fallen trees. Brooks was an experienced outdoorsman, but even he was impressed by the severity of the conditions. "You sure about this?" Brooks asked as Milan shouldered her pack. The weight felt familiar and strange at the same time, heavier than she remembered, but balanced in a way that brought back muscle memories from thousands of climbs. She looked up at the mountain. The new snow was brilliant white in the morning sun, but she could see signs of instability everywhere. Small slides that had already occurred, wind-loaded slopes, areas where the snow had settled into dangerous configurations. "No," she said honestly, "but those people need help." Brooks handed her the satellite phone. "Check in every 2 hours, okay? And Milan, be careful up there." Milan nodded and started up the trail. The snow was deep but manageable with snowshoes, and she quickly found her rhythm. The trail was completely unmarked now, but she could still follow its general path by reading the terrain, the subtle changes in slope angle, and the placement of trees that indicated where the original path had been cut. The first mile was relatively easy. The trail stayed on the ridge, and the snow was stable. But as she gained elevation, the conditions became more challenging. The wind had created cornices, overhanging ledges of snow that could collapse without warning. She had to test each step carefully, using her trekking poles to probe for hidden dangers. After 2 hours of steady climbing, Milan reached a viewpoint where she could see the care home below and to the west. It looked intact from this distance, with smoke coming from the chimney. That was encouraging. It meant they had heat and probably emergency power. But what she saw above the building made her stomach drop. A massive cornice hung over the care home like a frozen tsunami wave. It was at least 50 feet thick and stretched across the entire face of the mountain above the facility. The new snow from the storm had only made it larger and more unstable, and she could see stress cracks running along its base. Milan pulled out binoculars and studied the snow conditions more carefully. Everything about the situation was wrong. The temperature was rising as the sun heated the new snow. The cornice was showing multiple stress fractures, and the wind was picking up again, which would add even more weight to the already overloaded structure. She called Chief Williams on the satellite phone. "Chief Williams, this is Milan. I can see the care home and we have a serious problem." "What kind of problem?" Milan described what she was seeing in technical terms, trying to keep her voice calm and professional. "That cornice is going to fall. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. When it does, it'll trigger a massive avalanche. The care home is directly in the path of the debris flow." "How much time do we have?" Milan studied the cornice again. The stress cracks were growing even as she watched, and she could hear the mountain talking. The subtle sounds of snow settling and adjusting that experienced mountaineers learned to recognize as warnings. "I don't know. Could be hours, could be days. But those people need to be evacuated immediately." "Can you get to them?" Milan looked at the terrain below her. The final approach to the care home was the most dangerous part of the route, a steep slope covered in unstable snow. But it was passable if she was careful and lucky. "I can try. But Chief, you need to start organizing an evacuation plan right now. Even if I can get everyone out of the building, we're going to need a way to get them down the mountain safely." "What do you suggest?" Milan was already forming a plan in her mind. It was dangerous and would require perfect timing, but it might work. "Get every snowmobile in town and find me some sleds or toboggans, as many as you can. Meet me at the bottom of Hillside Drive in 4 hours." "Milan, what are you planning?" But Milan had already hung up. She was studying the avalanche slope, trying to find the safest route down to the care home.
The descent toward Sunset Care Home was the most dangerous thing Milan had done in 8 years. Every step could trigger a slide that would bury both her and the building below. The slope was loaded with new snow that hadn't had time to bond properly with the underlying layers, creating what avalanche experts called a slab condition, a recipe for disaster. She moved slowly, placing each foot carefully and testing every step with her trekking poles. The snow made ominous settling sounds underneath her snowshoes, a bad sign that indicated the snowpack was under stress. She stayed as far to the left as possible, following a line of scrub trees and rock outcroppings that might help anchor the snow and provide some protection if a slide started. Halfway down, she heard a crack like a gunshot. A small slab of snow, about 10 feet wide and 3 feet thick, broke away and slid 50 yards before stopping. Milan froze, waiting to see if it would trigger a larger slide. When nothing else moved, she continued, but her heart was pounding. The care home grew larger as she approached. It was a 2-story building with a wraparound porch, designed to look homey and comfortable rather than institutional. The architecture was meant to provide dignity and warmth for its elderly residents, with large windows offering views of the valley and common areas designed for socializing. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a pleasant place to spend one's final years. Today, it looked terrifyingly vulnerable beneath the massive cornice that hung over it like a sword. Milan finally reached the building and knocked on the front door. It opened almost immediately, revealing a worried-looking woman in her 50s, wearing scrubs and a cardigan. Thank God. the woman said, her relief evident. "I'm Janet Reeves, the director. We've been trying to radio for help since yesterday evening." Milan introduced herself and stepped inside, grateful to be out of the cold and off the unstable slope. The building was warm and well lit, powered by a backup generator that hummed quietly in the basement. About a dozen elderly residents sat in the main living area, some playing cards at small tables, others watching the snow through large windows. They looked calm but concerned, the way people do when they sense something is wrong but aren't sure what. "How many people are in the building?" Milan asked. 42 residents and 12 staff members, Janet replied. "Some of our residents are quite frail. Several are bedridden and need constant care." Milan felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. 54 people, some of whom couldn't walk on their own, and a massive avalanche threat hanging over all of them. "Janet, I need you to listen carefully. This building is in immediate danger. There's an unstable cornice above us that could collapse at any time. When it does, it will trigger an avalanche that will destroy everything in its path." Janet's face went pale. "What do we do?" "We evacuate. Everyone. Right now." "But how?" "Most of our residents can't walk in deep snow. Many need wheelchairs or walkers. Some are on oxygen or other medical equipment." Milan was already thinking through the logistics. It was like planning a complex climb, but with much higher stakes and more variables to consider. "Do you have any sleds or toboggans? Anything we can use to transport people who can't walk?" "A few. The staff uses them to bring supplies up from the parking area when the roads are bad." "Get them. Also any blankets, sleeping bags, or warm clothing you can find. And make me a list of residents who need special medical attention or equipment." Janet nodded and hurried away. Milan walked to the large windows facing the mountain. The cornice was clearly visible now, a frozen monster hanging over them. As she watched, another stress crack appeared along its base, and she could hear subtle sounds from the mountain, creaking and settling, that indicated the snow structure was under increasing stress. She called Chief Williams again. "I'm in the building. 54 people total. Some are going to need significant help moving, and several have serious medical needs. The evacuation team is assembling now. But Milan, the forecast is calling for more snow this afternoon, and the temperature is supposed to drop tonight." That was bad news. More snow would increase the avalanche risk, and extreme cold would make the evacuation even more dangerous for elderly residents who might not be able to regulate their body temperature effectively. "How long until you can get the snowmobiles to the base of the mountain?" 2 hours, maybe less. We've got volunteers from 3 neighboring towns coming to help." Milan calculated times and distances in her head. It was about a mile from the care home to where Hillside Drive became passable for snowmobiles. Even with sleds and help, it would take time to move 54 people that distance through deep snow, and they'd have to do it before the cornice collapsed. Janet returned with several staff members, their arms full of winter clothing and equipment. "We have 4 sleds and 6 toboggans," she reported. "And we've identified 12 residents who will need to be carried or helped down the mountain." Milan gathered the staff around her. She recognized the look in their eyes, the mixture of fear and determination that she'd seen in climbing partners facing dangerous conditions. "Here's what we're going to do. We'll move people in groups of 4 or 5. The strongest residents will go first, helping to break trail and set up rest stops along the route. The staff will help transport those who need assistance." A young nurse named Carlos raised his hand. "What about Mrs. Patterson?" "She's on oxygen and can't be moved far from her concentrator." Milan had been afraid of this question. Medical equipment complicated everything. "How much portable oxygen do we have?" "Maybe 4 hours worth in small tanks?" "That would have to be enough." "Okay, new plan. Carlos, you stay with Mrs. Patterson and anyone else who absolutely can't be moved until the very end. The rest of us will get everyone else down to safety, then come back for the final group." Another staff member, a maintenance worker named Frank, pointed out the window at the cornice. What if that thing comes down while we're moving people? Milan looked at the unstable snow formation again. It was hard to judge exactly how much time they had, but every hour made it more dangerous. Then we'd better work fast. They spent the next hour organizing supplies and preparing residents. Milan was impressed by how calmly the elderly people accepted the news. Most of them had lived through wars, the Great Depression, and other crises, and they understood that sometimes life required courage in the face of danger. Mrs. Chen, the 93-year-old former teacher, even managed to joke about the situation. This is the most exciting thing that's happened since my nephew got married last spring. But Milan could see the fear in some faces too. These people had lived long lives, and they understood danger when they saw it.
As they prepared to leave, Milan pulled Janet aside for a private conversation. I need you to understand something. This is going to be the hardest thing any of us have ever done. People are going to get cold and tired. Some might panic. But we cannot stop moving once we start. In avalanche conditions, hesitation can get people killed. Janet nodded. I understand. One more thing. I'm going to need you to trust my decisions completely. If I say we change routes or pick up the pace or leave something behind, don't question it. Lives depend on everyone following instructions without debate. The first group consisted of 8 of the most mobile residents, along with 3 staff members. They bundled up in every warm piece of clothing they could find. Multiple layers of sweaters, heavy coats, wool hats, and insulated gloves. The residents who could walk were given snowshoes, while others were loaded into sleds lined with blankets and sleeping bags. Milan led them out the back door, away from the main avalanche path. The route she'd chosen was longer but safer, following a ridge line that curved around the base of the mountain before connecting with Hillside Drive. It would add distance to their journey, but it offered better protection from potential slides. The going was slow and difficult. Even the strongest residents weren't used to moving through deep snow, and the altitude made breathing more difficult. Every few hundred yards, Milan called for rest stops, using these breaks to scan the mountainside above them for any sign that the cornice was about to collapse. The elderly residents showed remarkable courage and determination. Mr. Valdez, a retired mechanic who'd suffered a stroke the previous year, couldn't speak clearly, but insisted on walking rather than riding in a sled. Mrs. Kim, recovering from hip surgery just 2 months earlier, gritted her teeth and pushed through the pain. After an hour of difficult travel, they reached the first checkpoint, a cluster of large boulders that would provide some protection if the worst happened. Milan radioed ahead to Chief Williams. First group is at checkpoint 1. Send the snowmobiles up Hillside Drive as far as they can safely go. We'll meet them there. Copy that. How are the residents holding up? Milan looked back at the elderly people catching their breath behind the protective rocks. They were cold and tired, but their determination was inspiring. They're incredible, she said. The second half of the route was easier, mostly downhill through a grove of mature pine trees. But it was also more exposed to the potential avalanche path above. Milan kept the group moving as quickly as safely possible, constantly scanning the mountain for danger signs. Finally, after 2.5 hours of difficult travel, they reached the rendezvous point. 4 snowmobiles were waiting, along with Chief Williams and several volunteers from neighboring towns. They had brought more sleds, emergency medical supplies, and thermoses of hot coffee and soup. How many more trips? Chief Williams asked. Milan calculated quickly. 4 more groups, but the last group will include the bedridden residents. That's going to be the most challenging. We'll be ready. The National Guard is sending a helicopter as soon as weather permits, but that might not be until tomorrow. While the volunteers helped the first group onto snowmobiles for the ride to safety in town, Milan prepared for the trip back up the mountain. Each journey was getting more dangerous as the day wore on, and the snow conditions continued to deteriorate. By the time Milan made her third trip up to the care home, the situation had become critical. The cornice above the building had developed several new cracks, and she could hear the mountain talking more loudly. The settling sounds, creaking, and occasional small slides that indicated major instability throughout the snow structure. The second and third groups had made it down safely, but the physical and emotional toll was becoming evident on everyone involved. The staff members were exhausted from helping residents through the deep snow and increasingly difficult conditions. Some of the elderly people were showing early signs of hypothermia despite their warm clothing, and the medical supplies were running low. Now only 14 people remained in the building. 6 bedridden residents who required constant medical attention, 2 residents with serious mobility issues, and 6 staff members including Janet and Carlos. Milan gathered the remaining staff for a final briefing. She could see the exhaustion and worry in their faces, but also the determination that had carried them through the day. "This is going to be our most dangerous trip," she told them. "The snow conditions are deteriorating rapidly, and we're going to have to move faster than before. We'll also have to leave some things behind." "What about the medical equipment?" Carlos asked. "Some of these residents need their monitors and medications." "Bring only what's absolutely essential for the next few hours. Everything else stays. We can't risk lives for equipment." Janet looked worried. "Mrs. Patterson is very weak. I don't think she can handle being moved on a sled in these conditions. Her heart condition is serious, and the cold and stress could kill her." Milan had been thinking about this problem throughout the day. Mrs. Patterson was 86 years old and suffered from severe congestive heart failure. She'd been on supplemental oxygen for 2 years and rarely left her bed. Moving her through deep snow in near-freezing temperatures could trigger a cardiac event that would be fatal. But leaving her behind wasn't an option either. "Do we have any choice?" Milan asked. "If we don't move her, she'll definitely die when the avalanche hits," Janet said quietly. "At least this way, she has a chance." Milan nodded grimly. In the mountains, sometimes there were no good choices, only degrees of risk. They rigged up the most protected sled they could manage for Mrs. Patterson, with multiple layers of blankets, a windscreen made from a tarp, and chemical heat packs positioned around her body. She was so small and frail that she barely made a dent in the thick padding, but her eyes were alert, and she even managed a weak smile when Milan checked on her. "I've lived through the Great Depression, World War II, and raising 6 children," she whispered to Milan. "I think I can handle a little snow." The other bedridden residents were loaded onto sleds as well. Mr. Valdez, whose stroke had left him partially paralyzed, couldn't speak clearly, but squeezed Milan's hand when she checked his restraints. Mrs. Rodriguez, recovering from pneumonia, worried more about being a burden than about the danger. Mr. Thompson, whose dementia made him confused about what was happening, kept asking cheerfully when they were going fishing. As they prepared to leave the building for the final time, Milan took one last look at the cornice through the large windows. What she saw made her blood run cold. The main crack had widened significantly, and she could see actual movement along the entire cornice structure. Parts of it were sagging visibly. "We need to go now," she announced, her voice carrying an urgency that made everyone move faster. The final evacuation team assembled quickly in the building's lobby. Milan took the lead position, responsible for breaking trail and watching for danger signs. Janet and Carlos handled the medical aspects, monitoring the most vulnerable residents and managing their medications and oxygen supplies. Frank and the other staff members managed the sleds and kept the group moving together. They had to move more slowly this time because of the delicate human cargo they were transporting. but Milan kept pushing the pace as much as she dared. Every few minutes, she heard increasingly ominous sounds from above. Deep rumbling, sharp cracks, and the whisper of small slides that meant the cornice was getting closer to catastrophic failure. The residents on the sleds bore the difficult journey with remarkable stoicism. Mrs. Patterson dozed fitfully, her breathing shallow but steady. Mr. Valdez watched the passing scenery with bright, interested eyes, occasionally pointing at birds or interesting rock formations. Mrs. Rodriguez prayed quietly in Spanish, her lips moving constantly. Halfway to the first checkpoint, disaster struck without warning. Milan heard the sound first, a deep rumble like approaching thunder that seemed to come from inside the mountain itself. She spun around and saw the massive cornice breaking away from the mountainside in a spectacular cascade of white destruction. "Avalanche!" she screamed at the top of her lungs. "Everyone to the trees! Move! Move! Move!" The catastrophic slide started slowly, almost majestically, but quickly picked up tremendous speed and power. Thousands of tons of snow and ice roared down the mountainside, destroying everything in its path. The sound was deafening, like a freight train combined with breaking glass and thunder, all amplified beyond anything most people had ever experienced. Milan watched in horror as the avalanche engulfed Sunset Care Home completely. The building vanished in seconds, crushed and buried under an avalanche that was easily 20 feet deep. If they'd been even 10 minutes later leaving, they would all be dead. But the avalanche wasn't finished. The massive debris flow continued down the mountain, following the natural drainage patterns and heading directly toward their position. "To the trees!" Milan shouted again. "Get behind the big trees!" The staff members pulled the sleds carrying the bedridden residents toward a thick grove of mature pine trees. The trees wouldn't stop a massive avalanche, but they might deflect or slow the outer edges of the debris flow enough to save lives. Milan positioned herself between the approaching avalanche and the most vulnerable residents, particularly Mrs. Patterson's sled. If the debris flow reached them, she would absorb the first impact and hopefully give the others a few extra seconds to seek better protection. The sound was now overwhelming, a roar that seemed to penetrate not just the ears, but the entire body. The ground shook violently under their feet, and snow and debris filled the air, making it nearly impossible to breathe or see more than a few feet ahead. Milan could feel the pressure wave from the avalanche pushing against her body. Trees were snapping like toothpicks somewhere behind the wall of white death. The air itself seemed to be moving, creating winds that knocked people off their feet. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the avalanche slowed and stopped. The main debris flow had passed about 50 yards to their right, carving a deep channel through the forest and leaving behind a landscape that looked like a war zone. They were all covered in snow dust and small debris, coughing and struggling to see, but miraculously alive. Milan did a quick head count, her heart pounding with adrenaline and fear. Everyone was accounted for, though several people were clearly in shock from the terrifying experience. Mrs. Patterson's oxygen tank had been jarred loose and was hissing, but Carlos quickly shut off the valve and reconnected it properly. "Is everyone okay?" Milan called out, her voice hoarse from shouting and breathing snow-filled air. She got weak but positive responses from all the residents. The staff members were shaken and covered in snow, but uninjured. Mr. Valdez was actually smiling, apparently finding the whole experience exciting rather than terrifying. Milan's radio crackled to life. It was Chief Williams, his voice tight with worry and barely controlled panic. "Milan, we saw the avalanche from town. My God, the whole mountainside came down. Are you all right? Please respond." "We're alive," Milan replied, still breathing hard. "But the care home is completely gone. Buried under at least 20 feet of debris." Jesus Christ, what's your status? Milan looked around at the group. They were cold, tired, traumatized, and some were going into shock, but they were all breathing and conscious. We need immediate evacuation. Some of these residents are struggling with the cold and stress. Mrs. Patterson needs medical attention as soon as possible. The snowmobile teams are already on their way up. ETA 15 minutes. Can you hold your position? We'll hold, but hurry. While they waited for rescue, Milan organized the staff to provide first aid and psychological comfort to the residents. Mrs. Patterson was struggling more with the cold, despite being wrapped in multiple blankets, her lips taking on a bluish tint that indicated poor circulation. Mr. Valdez seemed to be having some difficulty breathing, possibly from inhaling snow dust during the avalanche. Mrs. Rodriguez was shivering uncontrollably, despite the chemical heat packs. "Janet," Milan said quietly, pulling the director aside, "we need to get these people warmed up fast, or we're going to lose someone to hypothermia or cardiac stress." Janet nodded and began organizing an impromptu shelter using sleds and blankets to block the wind. Carlos distributed the remaining chemical hand warmers from the medical kit and checked vital signs on the most vulnerable residents. Frank and the other staff members shared their own body heat with elderly residents who were showing signs of hypothermia. Milan kept watch for any signs of additional avalanche activity. The main danger had passed, but smaller secondary slides were still possible, and the mountain remained unstable after such a massive release of snow and debris. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Milan heard the blessed sound of snowmobile engines echoing through the forest. Chief Williams appeared first, followed by 6 other machines pulling heated rescue sleds equipped with medical supplies and emergency blankets. "Thank God," he said, when he saw the group huddled together but alive. "We thought we'd lost all of you." The final evacuation to safety was efficient and swift. The residents were carefully transferred to heated rescue sleds, and paramedics immediately began treating those with hypothermia, shock, and other medical concerns. Mrs. Patterson was given supplemental oxygen and cardiac medications. Mr. Valdez's breathing improved once he was warmed up and given bronchodilators. Mrs. Rodriguez stopped shivering once she was wrapped in heated blankets. As Milan watched the last rescue sled disappear down the mountain toward town and safety, she felt an overwhelming mixture of relief, exhaustion, and something she hadn't experienced in 8 long years. Genuine pride in her actions. They'd done it. All 54 people had been successfully evacuated from mortal danger. No one had been seriously injured, and everyone would live to see another day. But she also felt something deeper and more transformative than simple pride. For the first time since Sarah and David's deaths, she felt like she'd honored their memory by saving lives rather than losing them. She'd taken the hardest lesson of her life, the knowledge of how quickly things could go wrong in the mountains, and used it to keep people safe rather than allowing fear to paralyze her. The weight of guilt that had pressed down on her shoulders for 8 years didn't disappear completely, but it felt different now. Lighter, more manageable. She would always carry the responsibility for her friends' deaths, but now she also carried the knowledge that she'd saved 54 lives when it mattered most.
The White Peak Community Center had been hastily converted into an emergency shelter and medical triage area. Red Cross volunteers bustled around efficiently, providing food, warm clothing, and medical care to the evacuated residents of Sunset Care Home. The large gymnasium had been divided into sections: medical evaluation, temporary housing, and family reunion areas, where relatives who'd driven through dangerous conditions were being reunited with their loved ones. Milan sat in a corner chair, finally allowing herself to rest. Her body ached from the physical demands of the day. Her legs were sore from breaking trail through deep snow. Her shoulders burned from the weight of her pack, and her hands were raw from handling ropes and equipment in freezing conditions. but her mind was strangely clear and calm. For the first time since the accident 8 years ago, she felt like she'd done something unequivocally right. Dr. Sarah Patel, White Peak's physician, approached with a steaming cup of coffee and a concerned expression. "How are you holding up?" she asked, settling into the chair next to Milan. "I'm okay." "Tired, but okay. How are the residents?" "Remarkably well, considering what they've been through. Mrs. Patterson is stable. We've got her on continuous cardiac monitoring, but her vitals are improving. Mr. Valdez's breathing has returned to normal. Mrs. Rodriguez is warming up nicely, and her shivering has stopped completely." Milan nodded, feeling a deep sense of relief. "And the others?" "Everyone is going to be fine. We're keeping several people overnight for observation, mainly for hypothermia and dehydration. But I expect full recoveries across the board. A few people are dealing with some psychological shock from witnessing the avalanche, but that's completely understandable." Dr. Patel paused and looked at Milan seriously. "What you did today was extraordinary. You saved 54 lives under conditions that would have challenged a full mountain rescue team." Milan felt uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what needed to be done. Anyone with mountain experience would have—" "No," Dr. Patel interrupted firmly. "That's not true. What you did required much more than just technical knowledge. You took responsibility for other people's lives. You made life and death decisions under extreme pressure, and you led a dangerous evacuation that required both exceptional skill and tremendous personal courage. That's the definition of heroism." Before Milan could respond, she was gently surrounded by care home residents who'd learned where she was sitting. Mrs. Chen, the 93-year-old former teacher, moved slowly but determinedly across the room and hugged Milan tightly. "You're our guardian angel," she said with tears in her eyes. "You risked everything for us, and we will never, ever forget that." Other residents echoed the sentiment with heartfelt gratitude. Mr. Kozlov, a retired engineer who'd immigrated from Russia 60 years earlier, shook her hand formally and spoke with the dignity of someone who'd lived through real hardship. "In my country, we would give you the highest medal for what you did today. You are a true hero." Mrs. Kim, despite being wrapped in blankets and still recovering from hypothermia, insisted on personally thanking Milan. "You risked your life for people you barely knew. We are strangers, but you treated us like family." Mrs. Rodriguez, whose quiet prayers had helped sustain her during the evacuation, pressed a small silver cross into Milan's hand. "This was my grandmother's. I want you to have it, to remember that God works through people like you." Even Mr. Thompson, whose dementia often left him confused, seemed to understand the significance of what had happened. He patted Milan's shoulder and said clearly, "Thank you for bringing us home safe." Milan felt overwhelmed by the attention and gratitude. She wasn't used to being seen as a hero. For 8 years, she'd thought of herself as someone who'd failed catastrophically when it mattered most. Janet Reeves approached as the residents gradually dispersed back to their cots and meals. The care home director looked exhausted but deeply grateful. "Milan, I don't know how to begin thanking you," she said. "Without your knowledge and leadership, we would all be—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "You don't need to thank me," Milan replied. "I'm just glad everyone is safe. But I do need to thank you. And I need to tell you something else." Janet's voice became serious and official. "The insurance company and the state are going to investigate what happened today. There will probably be questions about why the care home was built in such a dangerous location, why we didn't have comprehensive evacuation plans, regulatory oversight issues, things like that." Milan nodded. She'd expected bureaucratic investigations. "I want you to know that I'm going to tell them the complete truth. That you assessed a dangerous situation correctly, that you organized and led a successful evacuation under impossible conditions, and that you saved 54 lives through your expertise and courage. You're a hero, Milan, whether you're comfortable with that label or not. As evening approached, Chief Williams found Milan and asked her to step outside for a private conversation. The town had been transformed by the day's events. News vans were arriving. Neighbors were bringing food and supplies to the community center, and there was an energy of people pulling together in crisis. "The mayor wants to see you tomorrow," he said. Something about a formal commendation ceremony. Probably media coverage, too. Milan shook her head immediately. "I don't want any ceremony or media attention." "I figured you'd say that." "But Milan, this is bigger than what you personally want. This town needs heroes, especially now when so many people feel hopeless about the world. You've given people something to believe in." They walked toward the parking lot, where news vans from 3 different television stations were already setting up equipment for evening broadcasts. "Oh no," Milan said, seeing the cameras and reporters. "I'm afraid the story's already going regional, maybe national. Former professional climber saves nursing home from avalanche." It's got everything: human interest, dramatic rescue, natural disaster. The media loves stories like this. Milan felt panic rising in her chest. She didn't want the attention, the interviews, the scrutiny. She didn't want to be called a hero on television or have her photograph in newspapers. "Chief, I can't do this. I'm not that person anymore." Chief Williams stopped walking and looked at her with genuine puzzlement. What person? The confident one. The leader. The person who makes life and death decisions for other people. "Milan, you just spent an entire day making life and death decisions. You led the evacuation of 54 people through some of the most dangerous terrain and conditions imaginable. If that doesn't make you a leader, I honestly don't know what does." Milan was quiet for a moment, thinking about Sarah and David, about the guilt she'd carried for so long, like a heavy backpack she could never set down. 8 years ago, I got 2 people killed on a mountain in Colorado. "I know," Chief Williams said gently. "Joe told me about the climbing accident. I looked up the incident report online. I was the expedition leader. I made the critical decisions. It was my fault they died." "Was it really your fault?" Milan looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean, did you make decisions that were intentionally reckless? Did you ignore established safety protocols? Did you put your team in danger for selfish or ego-driven reasons?" "No, but then it wasn't your fault. It was a tragic accident that happened despite your best efforts and judgment. There's a difference." Milan felt tears starting to form in her eyes. "You don't understand. They trusted me completely. And today, 54 people trusted you completely. And they're all alive and safe because of that trust." Chief Williams let that sink in before continuing. "Milan, I've been in emergency services for 25 years. I've seen a lot of people who think they're heroes but aren't, and I've seen real heroes who don't think they deserve the title. Real heroes are the ones who act despite their fear, who take responsibility even when it's difficult and scary, who put other people's safety and welfare above their own comfort. That's exactly what you did today." Milan wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I was terrified the entire time." "Of course you were terrified. Anyone with sense and experience would be terrified in those conditions. But you did what needed to be done anyway. That's courage." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the news crews set up their equipment and organize their stories about the day's dramatic rescue. "What do I tell them when they want to interview me?" Milan asked. "The truth. That you saw people in immediate danger, and you used your skills and knowledge to help them. That's all. You don't have to be eloquent or inspiring, just honest." Chapter 6. New Beginnings. The interview with Channel 7 News was shorter and less invasive than Milan had feared. The reporter, a serious young woman named Jessica Martinez, asked straightforward questions about the evacuation process, the avalanche conditions, and Milan's climbing background. Milan tried to downplay her individual role, emphasizing the teamwork of the care home staff and the coordinated response of the town's emergency services.
But the story that aired that evening on the 6 o'clock news painted her as an unambiguous hero. The footage showed the massive avalanche scar on the mountainside where Sunset Care Home had been completely obliterated, a debris field 20 feet deep, covering several acres. The reporter described Milan as a former professional mountain climber who risked her life to save 54 people from certain death in one of the most dramatic rescues in Colorado history. Milan watched the broadcast from her small apartment, feeling uncomfortable with the dramatic language, but also experiencing a small, unfamiliar sense of accomplishment and self-worth. Her phone rang constantly that evening. Reporters from newspapers and television stations across Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah wanted interviews. Old climbing friends who'd heard the news called to congratulate her and express amazement that she was back in the mountains. Even her estranged sister in California, whom she hadn't spoken to in 3 years, reached out to express pride and love. But the call that surprised her most came from Janet Reeves at 10 o'clock that evening. Milan, I hope I'm not calling too late, but I wanted to reach you with some news before you heard it elsewhere. What kind of news? Good news, I hope. The insurance company has agreed to rebuild Sunset Care Home, but obviously in a much safer location. The board of directors held an emergency meeting this evening, and they want to offer you a position with the new facility. Milan was taken aback. What kind of position? Safety coordinator and emergency planning director. You'd be responsible for developing evacuation procedures, training staff in emergency response, coordinating with local emergency services, and ensuring that we never again find ourselves in the kind of situation we faced today. It would be a full-time position with excellent benefits and a salary commensurate with your expertise. Milan felt her heart racing. The job would mean leaving her simple, anonymous life as a street cleaner. It would mean taking on responsibility for other people's safety again, putting herself in positions where her decisions could mean the difference between life and death. Janet, I'm not sure I'm qualified for something like that. Are you kidding? After what happened today, you're probably the most qualified person in the entire state for this kind of work. Milan thought about it seriously. The job would use her mountain skills in a meaningful way rather than letting them atrophy. It would mean helping people instead of just avoiding responsibility. Can I think about it? Of course. Take all the time you need. But Milan, I hope you'll seriously consider it. You have a gift for keeping people safe in dangerous situations. It seems wrong to waste that gift. The next few days brought a steady parade of visitors to Milan's apartment and attention she'd never experienced. The mayor presented her with a ceremonial key to the city in a brief ceremony at City Hall. The Colorado governor's office sent an official letter of commendation. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "White Peak's Guardian Angel Saves 54 Lives." But the visit that meant the most came from Mrs. Patterson 3 days after the rescue. The elderly woman climbed the stairs to Milan's apartment very slowly, supported by her granddaughter and using a walker. When Milan opened the door, Mrs. Patterson immediately reached out for a gentle hug. "I wanted to thank you in person," she said in her soft, slightly breathless voice. "And to give you something?" She handed Milan a small, wrapped package tied with a ribbon. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf in mountain colors, deep blues, pristine whites, and various shades of gray. "I made it myself over the past 3 days," Mrs. Patterson said with obvious pride. "My hands aren't as steady as they used to be, but I wanted you to have something to keep you warm when you go back up into the mountains." Milan looked at her with surprise. "What makes you think I'm going back into the mountains?" Mrs. Patterson smiled with the wisdom that comes from 9 decades of living. "Because that's where you belong, dear. I could see it in your eyes during the evacuation. You weren't just afraid of the mountains or enduring them. You were at home there, even in the most dangerous circumstances." That evening, Milan walked to White Peak's small cemetery. It was a peaceful place overlooking the valley, with headstones dating back to the town's mining days. She found the memorial section dedicated to people who'd died in mountain accidents and sat on a wooden bench facing the peaks. For the first time in 8 years, Milan allowed herself to really remember Sarah and David, not just their deaths, but their lives, their dreams, their friendship, their shared love of wild places. She thought about Sarah's infectious laughter and her ambitious dreams of climbing Everest. She remembered David's gentle nature, his encyclopedic knowledge of geology, and his quiet joy in simply being among the peaks. She recalled countless shared moments on successful climbs, the triumph of reaching summits, the beauty of sunrise above the clouds, the deep satisfaction of moving safely through dangerous terrain. They would have been proud of what she'd done during the avalanche rescue. She was absolutely sure of that. They would have understood that she'd taken the hardest lesson of her life, the knowledge of how quickly things could go wrong in the mountains, and used it to keep people safe. Milan pulled out her phone and called Janet Reeves. "Janet, it's Milan. About that job offer, I accept." "That's wonderful. When can you start?" Milan looked up at the mountains, silhouetted against the evening sky. For the first time in years, they looked inviting rather than threatening. "How about Monday morning?" 3 weeks later, Milan stood in the temporary offices that Sunset Care Home had established in a rented building downtown. The walls were covered with topographic maps, weather monitoring equipment, and emergency communication devices. She was deep in conversation with an architect, an engineer, and a representative from the Colorado Avalanche Information Center. "The new site is perfect from a safety standpoint," the engineer was saying, pointing to a location on the map. "It's on stable ground, well away from any avalanche paths, with multiple vehicle access routes." Milan studied the proposed location carefully. It was in the valley, surrounded by gentle hills rather than steep mountainsides. Emergency vehicles would be able to reach it in any weather conditions. "What about staff training?" Milan asked. This was her primary focus now, ensuring that everyone who worked at the facility understood mountain safety and emergency procedures. "That's where you come in," said Janet, who'd been coordinating the rebuilding effort. "We want you to develop a comprehensive safety program, not just for natural disasters, but for medical emergencies, fire safety, security issues, everything." Milan felt the familiar weight of responsibility, but it was different now. Instead of feeling crushing and frightening, it felt purposeful and manageable. Over the following months, Milan threw herself into her new role with energy and enthusiasm she hadn't felt in years. She developed detailed evacuation procedures for every conceivable emergency. She established relationships with search and rescue teams, the National Weather Service, and emergency medical services. She created training programs that turned the care home staff into one of the most prepared emergency response teams in the region. But her most important work was less visible and more personal. Milan began offering mountain safety workshops to anyone who wanted to learn: hikers, skiers, emergency responders, and ordinary citizens who lived in avalanche-prone areas. Milan stood at the base of Copper Mountain, wearing her new safety coordinator uniform and the scarf Mrs. Patterson had made for her. Behind her, the newly constructed Sunset Care Home sat safely in the valley, surrounded by gardens and accessible roads, well away from any natural hazards. She was leading a mountain safety workshop for care home staff and emergency responders from throughout the region. The group included firefighters from 4 different departments, paramedics, search and rescue volunteers, and even some local business owners who wanted to better understand the risks their communities faced. The key to avalanche safety, Milan explained, is learning to read the terrain and understand snow conditions before they become dangerous. Today, we're going to practice recognizing warning signs and making good decisions in uncertain conditions. As they hiked up a safe section of mountain trail, Milan pointed out various features: safe zones where people could take shelter, potential slide paths to avoid, and the telltale signs of unstable snow that every mountain resident should know. The participants asked intelligent questions and took careful notes. Milan found that she enjoyed teaching, sharing knowledge that could save lives. At the site where the old care home had stood, they paused for a moment of reflection. The avalanche debris had been cleared away by heavy equipment, but the scar on the mountainside remained visible, a stark reminder of the power of natural forces. "This is why we do this training," Milan said to the group, "so that we can recognize dangerous conditions before they become crises, and so that we're prepared to respond effectively when bad things happen, despite our best efforts." Carlos, who had stayed on as head nurse at the new facility, raised his hand. "Milan, what made you decide to come back to the mountains after what you'd been through? I think if I'd experienced what you had, I would have been afraid to ever set foot on a mountain again." Milan looked around at the group. Dedicated people who had chosen careers helping others, people who understood that some risks were worth taking. "I realized something important that day," she said. "Fear isn't the opposite of courage. Fear is information. It tells us when something is dangerous, but it doesn't have to prevent us from doing what's right or necessary." She gestured toward the valley below, where the new care home sat safely surrounded by level ground and gardens. "Sometimes the most important thing we can do is use our fear to make better decisions, to be more careful, more prepared, more aware of the risks we're taking and the responsibilities we have to other people." The workshop continued for another 2 hours, with practical exercises in avalanche rescue techniques, emergency communications, and group decision-making under stress. As the participants prepared to hike back down to their vehicles, Chief Williams approached Milan. "How does it feel?" he asked. "How does what feel?" "Being back in the mountains. Leading people. Being the person everyone looks to for expertise and guidance." Milan considered the question carefully. For 8 years, she'd avoided responsibility and leadership, choosing work that required no life and death decisions and no one depending on her specialized knowledge. But standing here on the mountain, teaching others how to stay safe in dangerous environments, she realized something profound. She hadn't lost her ability to be a leader when Sarah and David died. She'd just been too frightened and guilt-ridden to use that ability. "It feels right," she said finally. "It feels like I'm doing what I was meant to do." As they descended toward the valley, Milan looked back once more at the mountain peak. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the snow, creating a landscape of incredible beauty and inherent danger. She thought about the residents of Sunset Care Home, now safely housed in their new, carefully designed facility. She thought about the dozens of emergency responders she'd trained in mountain safety over the past 6 months. She thought about the search and rescue operations she'd helped coordinate, the lives that had been saved through better preparation and training. Mrs. Chen had been right that day in the community center. Milan was a guardian angel, not because she was perfect or fearless, but because she'd learned to use her skills, experience, and hard-won wisdom to protect others from the dangers she understood so well. 1 year after the avalanche, Milan found herself standing on Eagle Ridge Trail again, but this time, she wasn't alone. She was leading a group of 24 people, care home residents who were able to hike, their family members, and staff on what had become an annual memorial hike. The weather was perfect: clear skies, gentle winds, and excellent visibility. They weren't going anywhere near avalanche terrain, just to a safe viewpoint where they could see both the old site and the new facility. Mrs. Chen, now 94 but still spry, was using hiking poles but keeping pace with people half her age. "This is much more pleasant than our last mountain adventure," she said with a laugh. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on coming despite her heart condition. She was riding in a special wheeled carrier designed for trail use, clearly enjoying every minute of the excursion. When they reached the viewpoint, Milan gathered the group in a circle. The avalanche scar was still visible on Copper Mountain, but nature was already beginning the process of healing. New vegetation was starting to grow in the disturbed soil. "A year ago, we all faced something that could have ended badly," Milan said. "But we got through it together, and we learned something important about ourselves and each other." Mr. Valdez, whose speech had continued to improve, spoke up clearly. "We learned that even when bad things happen, good people can make the difference." Milan nodded. "That's exactly right." "We also learned that it's not enough just to survive difficult situations. We have to learn from them and use that knowledge to help others." She gestured toward the new care home, visible in the valley below. "The new facility isn't just safer, it's better in every way. We took what we learned from a dangerous situation and used it to build something better." Janet stepped forward. "I have an announcement to make. The Colorado Department of Public Safety has asked Milan to head up a new statewide program for emergency preparedness in senior care facilities. She'll be training people all across Colorado and sharing what we've learned here in White Peak." The group erupted in applause and congratulations. Milan felt a familiar blush of embarrassment, but also genuine pride in what they'd all accomplished together. As they prepared for the hike back down, Mrs. Patterson called Milan over to her carrier. "I have something for you," she said, pulling out another hand-knitted item. This time, it was a hat in the same mountain colors as the scarf, with a pattern that included small images of snowflakes and peaks. "For your new job," Mrs. Patterson said, "you'll be traveling to different mountains now, and you'll need to stay warm." Milan accepted the gift with genuine emotion. "Mrs. Patterson, you don't need to keep making things for me."
"Oh, but I do," the elderly woman replied with a mischievous smile. "It gives me something useful to do with my hands, and it makes me feel like I'm part of your adventures." 2 years after the avalanche, Milan stood in the conference room of the Colorado Emergency Management Department in Denver. She was presenting the final report on the Mountain Communities Safety Initiative, a program that had trained over 500 emergency responders and evaluated the safety of 89 senior care facilities across the state. "The results have exceeded our expectations," Milan told the assembled officials. "Not only have we identified and corrected dozens of potentially dangerous situations, but we've created a network of trained responders who can help each other during emergencies."
The program had been so successful that 3 other states had requested similar initiatives. Milan had been asked to expand the program nationally, which would mean significant travel and a much larger budget. After the presentation, Milan drove back to White Peak. The familiar mountain roads felt like coming home, and she realized she'd made her decision about the national expansion. She found Janet in the garden behind Sunset Care Home, supervising the planting of a memorial grove for the residents who'd been lost to natural causes during the past 2 years. "How did the presentation go?" Janet asked. "Well, very well. They want me to take the program national." "That's wonderful. When do you start?" Milan was quiet for a moment, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. "I'm not taking it," she said finally. Janet looked surprised. "Why not?" It's a tremendous opportunity because I've learned something important about myself. I'm not meant to be a bureaucrat in Denver, sitting in meetings and managing programs from an office. I'm meant to be in the mountains, working directly with people, teaching them how to stay safe. Milan gestured toward the care home, where residents were visible through the large windows, enjoying their evening activities. This is where I belong. Not because I'm afraid to try something new, but because this work, training people, building safety programs, being part of a community, this is what gives my life meaning. Janet smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. We've just been approved for a major expansion of our training programs. We could use a full-time director of mountain safety education. 3 years after the avalanche, Milan stood at the dedication ceremony for the Milan Rodriguez Mountain Safety Education Center, built adjacent to the new Sunset Care Home. She'd protested the naming, but had been outvoted by the board of directors, the town council, and most importantly, the care home residents themselves. We want people to know who saved us, Mrs. Chen had said when Milan objected. We want your name associated with keeping people safe. The center was beautiful. A modern building with large windows overlooking the mountains, equipped with the latest weather monitoring technology, emergency communication systems, and training facilities. It would serve as a regional hub for mountain safety education, hosting workshops for emergency responders, outdoor enthusiasts, and anyone who lived or worked in avalanche country. As Milan cut the ribbon, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the depths of guilt and self-imposed isolation to becoming a recognized expert in mountain safety and emergency preparedness. From someone who had avoided responsibility to someone who actively sought opportunities to help others stay safe. The ceremony was attended by over 200 people, including Governor Martinez, who'd flown in specifically for the event. Search and rescue teams from across Colorado were represented, as were emergency management officials from 6 states who'd implemented programs based on Milan's work. But the people who mattered most to Milan were in the front row, the original residents and staff of Sunset Care Home. Mrs. Patterson, now 90, sat in her wheelchair, wearing a new hand-knitted sweater. Mrs. Chen, at 95, was still sharp and active, serving on the center's advisory board. Carlos had become the facility's emergency coordinator. Janet had been promoted to regional director of senior care services. Even Mr. Thompson, whose dementia had progressed, seemed to understand the significance of the day. He kept pointing at Milan and saying, "She brought us home safe." During her speech, Milan spoke about the lessons she'd learned from the avalanche rescue. 3 years ago, I thought my mountain climbing career had ended in failure and tragedy. I believed that my knowledge and experience were tainted by the mistakes I'd made and the friends I'd lost. I was wrong. She paused, looking out at the crowd of people whose lives had been touched by the programs she'd developed. What I learned that day on Copper Mountain is that our most difficult experiences, our failures, our losses, our moments of greatest fear, can become our greatest sources of strength if we have the courage to face them and learn from them. She gestured toward the care home, where several residents were visible at the windows, watching the ceremony. The 54 people we evacuated that day didn't just survive because of technical knowledge or climbing skills. They survived because when faced with a crisis, people chose to work together, to trust each other, and to put others' needs before their own safety. That's the most important lesson we can teach. After the ceremony, Milan walked through the new education center with a small group of visitors. The building included classrooms, a library of mountain safety resources, a weather monitoring station that provided real-time data to the National Weather Service, and a memorial wall honoring people who died in mountain accidents throughout Colorado's history. Sarah Martinez and David Kim's names were on that wall, along with a photograph of the 3 of them on their last successful climb together. Milan paused in front of it, as she did every day when she came to work. They would have loved this place, she said quietly to Chief Williams, who'd been walking beside her. I think they'd be proud of what you've built here, he replied. You've turned their memory into something that saves lives. Milan nodded. She'd finally found a way to honor Sarah and David's memory that felt right, not by avoiding the mountains or trying to forget what had happened, but by using her experience to help others navigate the same dangers they'd all faced. As the sun set behind the peaks, Milan stood on the center's observation deck, looking out at the landscape that had shaped her life in so many ways. Tomorrow, she would lead another training session for emergency responders from Wyoming. Next week, she was scheduled to evaluate the safety procedures at a senior facility in Utah. The month after that, she would testify before a congressional subcommittee about improving emergency preparedness in mountain communities. The work was challenging and sometimes dangerous, but it was also deeply meaningful. Every person she trained, every safety procedure she helped develop, every emergency plan she reviewed potentially saved lives. She was using the hardest lessons of her life to help others avoid similar tragedies. Mrs. Patterson appeared on the deck, pushed in her wheelchair by her great-granddaughter. I wanted to see the sunset from up here, she explained. And I have something for you. This time the gift was a pair of hand-knitted mittens with intricate patterns that included images of mountains, rescue equipment, and small hearts. These are the last things I'll be able to make for you, Mrs. Patterson said. My hands are getting too stiff for detailed work, but I wanted to finish the set. Milan knelt beside the wheelchair and took the elderly woman's hands in hers. Mrs. Patterson, you've given me so much more than just warm clothing. You've given me friendship and support and the belief that what I do matters. What you do does matter, dear, more than you'll ever know. As they watched the sun disappear behind the peaks, Milan reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken. She'd started as a professional climber seeking adventure and personal achievement. She'd been broken by tragedy and loss, retreating into anonymity and avoiding the very skills that defined her. But the avalanche had forced her to confront her fears and rediscover her purpose. She'd learned that true heroism wasn't about fearless action or perfect decision-making. It was about acting despite fear, learning from mistakes, and using your abilities to help others even when the stakes were high and the outcomes uncertain. The mountains would always be dangerous. Avalanches would continue to threaten communities like White Peak. People would still make mistakes and face situations beyond their control. But now there were programs and people and systems in place to minimize those risks, to prepare for emergencies, and to save lives when disasters struck. Milan touched the silver cross Mrs. Rodriguez had given her 3 years earlier, which she now wore every day. It reminded her that she was part of something larger than herself, a community of people committed to keeping each other safe. As the stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky, Milan felt a deep sense of peace and purpose. She'd found her way home, not to a place, but to a calling. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The mountains stretched endlessly around her, beautiful and dangerous and eternal. They would always demand respect, skill, and constant vigilance. But they would also continue to offer opportunities for growth, service, and the kind of meaningful work that made life worth living. Milan Rodriguez had become the guardian angel Mrs. Chen said she was, not through perfection or fearlessness, but through the willingness to turn her greatest failures into her greatest strengths. She'd learned that true courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act in service of others despite that fear. In the distance, snow was beginning to fall on the highest peaks, promising another season of challenges and opportunities. But Milan was ready for whatever came next. She was home where she belonged, in the mountains, keeping people safe, building something meaningful from the hardest lessons life had to offer. The hero's journey wasn't over. It was just becoming what it was always meant to be. Not a single moment of dramatic rescue, but a lifetime of quiet service, constant vigilance, and the daily choice to use her gifts in service of others' safety and well-being. And in that choice, Milan had found not just redemption, but purpose, community, and a peace that had eluded her for 8 long years. She discovered that sometimes the most important journeys don't take you to new places. They bring you home to who you were always meant to be. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most, and where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.